A sunny autumn day in 1980 had started beautifully for 19-year-old Bobby. It was his first day at SUNY Sullivan College in New York, and everyone on campus was welcoming him with extraordinary warmth. Truly extraordinary. The guys were asking how his summer vacation had gone, while girls were running up to him, hugging him around the neck, even kissing him. Naturally confused by all this attention, Bobby wandered around aimlessly, thinking about how genuinely friendly these people seemed, telling himself this must be some kind of school tradition, until someone suddenly called out behind him, "Welcome, Eddie." But he was Bobby, a brand new student at the school. So who was Eddie? Robert Bobby Shafran had been born on July 12, 1961, at Long Island Jewish Hospital in Queens, New York. His family lived in Scarsdale, a wealthy neighborhood north of Manhattan. His father, Mort Shafran, was a well-known doctor, and his mother was a lawyer. Bobby knew that he had been adopted, just like his older sister, but until that first day of college, he had never really dwelled on his biological family, choosing instead to enjoy his youth, until life began preparing some major surprises for him. A student who happened to be Eddie's roommate, immediately noticing how identical Bobby looked to Eddie, asked him if he was adopted, and upon hearing yes, jokingly said, "You know, you might actually have a twin," shocking Bobby in the process. After recovering from the initial surprise, Bobby made contact with Eddie over the phone, and the moment he heard the voice on the other end, he understood that this was real, because the voice sounded exactly like his own. The voice belonged to Edward Galland, Eddie, who had also been born on July 12, 1961, in Queens, New York. Eddie was the second child of a middle-class, conservative family living on Long Island, and he too had an older adopted sister. His father, Elliot Galland, was a disciplined and devoted schoolteacher. Eddie was at home when Bobby called, and it did not take him long to realize that Bobby was his twin, especially since both of them had been adopted through the Louise Wise Services Agency and born on the same day. When they finally met and saw each other face to face, the world seemed to stop for them. It was hard to believe, but they were twin brothers meeting for the first time after 19 years of living completely unaware of each other's existence, and if not for a coincidence, one that brought them together, they might never have met at all. When journalists got wind of the story, they naturally jumped on it, and soon this astonishing, perhaps tragic, perhaps mysterious tale began appearing in newspapers and on television. But the publication of the twins' photographs would soon reveal an entirely new truth. Ellen Noose, a close friend of David Kellman, nearly dropped his jaw when he saw Bobby and Eddie's photos in the paper, because their faces, their large pudgy hands, and their big cheerful smiles looked uncannily like her friend David. When he showed him the paper, the 19-year-old David initially thought the resemblance was just a coincidence. After all, people could look alike. But as he read details like adopted, 19 years old, Long Island Jewish Hospital, and Louise Wise Adoption Agency, he began to sweat, because this was far too much to be a coincidence. He too had been born on the same date, in the same place, adopted through the same agency. The only difference being that he had been adopted by Jack and Claire Kellman, and he too had an adopted older sister. As David investigated further, he became convinced he understood the situation completely. The other two didn't yet know it, but they weren't twins, they were triplets. When he finally picked up the phone and called Eddie's house, telling his mother that he had seen the twins in the newspaper and saying, "I think there's a third one, and it's me," she dropped the phone in shock. Learning that they had two more brothers they had never known about for 19 years, the young men, understandably stunned, met at their aunt's house, instantly embracing and bonding with one another. In fact, they behaved as if they had known each other forever, joking, wrestling on the floor, running around, savoring the reunion as though they were making up for the childhood they had missed. Their emotions were indescribable. They moved the same way, went to the same places, laughed at the same things, as if a life split into three pieces had finally become whole again. And from that moment on, it seemed unlikely those pieces would ever separate. They began spending wild nights together, sleeping together, traveling together, eating together, and they were incredibly happy. and at that time, that was all that mattered. They had not yet begun to think about what the future might hold, or what the missing pieces of their story were. When it was first believed they were reunited twins, they had already made headlines. But once it was revealed that they were actually reunited triplets, media attention intensified even more. They appeared on TV shows, were featured in every major newspaper, and went viral, with people loving their story that began tragically, yet progressed in such a surprising and heartwarming way. Sitting side by side on stage, they talked about feeling the same things, thinking the same thoughts, liking the same types of girls, preferring the same colors, even smoking the same brand of cigarettes, demonstrating that despite growing up in completely different environments, their personalities were strikingly similar due to their shared genetics. However, there was one very important detail. Each of them had been raised in a different kind of family. David, the last to be found, had grown up in a working-class family. Eddie's parents belonged to the middle class and were devoted to traditional values, and Bobby, by contrast, had grown up in a relatively wealthy household. Even more surprising details followed. Oddly enough, David's father, the warmest and most affectionate among them, had been nicknamed Boobala, a Yiddish term expressing affection like hugging and kissing, and when he learned that his son had two identical brothers, he welcomed them warmly, treating them like his own and spending time with them, while the other parents' attitudes were comparatively more reserved. Still, despite all the joy, there remained a major unresolved question. Why had these triplets been separated in the first place? Their adoptive parents requested a meeting with the agency to ask why the brothers had been split up when they were only 6 months old, but agency officials dismissively claimed that they believed it would be too difficult for a single family to adopt all 3 children together, an explanation that failed to fully satisfy the families, especially since it seemed the agency had also actively prevented the siblings from knowing about one another. Something was clearly wrong, but what exactly remained unclear. As time passed, the triplets grew into adulthood, meeting constantly and trying to make up for lost time with remarkable harmony. While their families aged, marriages happened, and they began forming families of their own, which eventually led them, accompanied by the thought that we surely weren't delivered by storks, to seek out their biological family. Since multiple sets of triplets being born at the same hospital on the same day was highly unlikely, it wasn't difficult for them to find records at the New York Public Library of a woman who had given birth to triplets on July 12, 1961. Their biological mother was a woman who had likely carried the pain of a mistake made under the influence of alcohol at the age of 19 during a prom night for her entire life. And astonishingly, it turned out that not 3 but 4 children had been born from that mistake, one of whom had died during childbirth. After a brief investigation, the triplets met their biological mother, who played little role in their daily lives. And although she was biologically their mother, each of them felt that their real mothers were the women waiting for them at home. And after a short meeting, that chapter closed for all of them. For the triplets, finding each other had been the most important thing, and that mission was complete, though one might still wonder about their striking lack of urgency in uncovering the deeper truth behind it all. Fortunately, someone out there continued to ask, yes, but why? About 10 years after their reunion, in the mid-1990s, journalist Lawrence Wright decided to dig deeper, suspecting there was more beneath this extraordinary story. And while researching, he came across psychological studies involving twins and triplets who had been separated at birth and raised without any knowledge of each other. And would you guess which triplet babies in those studies came from a New York adoption agency? Of course, it was these triplets. From there, everything unraveled like a loose thread. They were not victims of fate, but of a scientific experiment in psychology. The architects of the study had deliberately separated them, deliberately placed them with families of different socio-economic status, and observed them for years like lab subjects. Clues to the existence of this experiment had actually been present since infancy, as representatives from the adoption agency frequently visited their homes, observed the children, took notes, and even filmed them, telling the families this was merely routine follow-up to monitor the development of adopted children. While the 3 brothers were growing up unaware of each other, within a 160-kilometer radius. The Louise Weiss Adoption Agency knew everything about them, tracking them and conducting psychological research on them. Peter Neubauer, an Austrian-born child psychiatrist, who by the 1960s had become one of the most influential child psychologists in the United States, was deeply interested in the nature versus nurture debate, and unlike others, had the opportunity to secretly test his theories by forming a covert relationship with Louise Weiss, one of the largest adoption agencies in the country. Whenever identical twins were put up for adoption, Neubauer would be notified and involved in selecting adoptive parents, after which researchers working for him would secretly observe the children for years. And when the agency was given the chance to place the triplets in 1961, Neubauer seized the opportunity, considering it even more valuable than studying identical twins, and ensured that each child was placed with a different family, even if one family had been willing to adopt all three. His sole focus was his research, and neither the children nor their families knew they were triplets. Yet one by one, and then all three, through what could be called fate or luck, they eventually reunited. Lawrence Wright's investigation and his article published in the New Yorker finally exposed the entire story, and in time, life moved on, with the triplets, once inseparable, turning their bond into a business partnership by opening a restaurant in New York called the Triplets, which initially thrived thanks to their fame, bringing in significant money, though not everything would remain rosy forever. Despite their similarities, the three eventually became aware of their differences. Bobby, raised in a wealthy family, left the restaurant to pursue his dream of becoming a lawyer, a decision that deeply damaged their relationship. Eddie, raised in a middle-class household, was the most emotionally volatile, married with a child, and outwardly a cheerful family man, yet internally struggling with severe psychological issues rooted in his authoritarian upbringing. And David, raised in a working-class family, was the most stable of the three. Though genetically identical, their upbringing differed exactly as the experiment intended, and after Bobby left and the restaurant's popularity declined, things worsened. Emotional problems escalated, and Eddie was diagnosed with manic depression, a condition linked to their biological mother's known mental illness, making them subjects not only of environmental influence, but also hereditary vulnerability. Over time, Eddie's condition deteriorated further, leading to hospitalization, and despite sharing the same genes as his brothers, he never recovered, ultimately taking his own life in 1995 at the age of 34, leaving one of those three identical, beaming smiles forever gone. Journalist Wright attempted to uncover more details about the experiment, but was unsuccessful, as psychologist Neubauer, alarmed by growing criticism, decided not to publish the findings, revealing that many separated siblings, not just these three, had been subjects. And upon his death in 2008, he donated over 11,000 pages of research documents to Yale University with instructions that they not be released before 2066. Today, Bobby works as a lawyer and lives in Brooklyn with his wife and 2 children, while David is also married, has 2 children, and works at an insurance company in New Jersey, meaning that with their number reduced from 3 to 2, life goes on as happily as possible. But whether the ultimate question has truly been answered remains debatable. Are our behaviors and lifestyles shaped more by our genes or by our environment? The prevailing view among researchers today is that both play significant roles, with genes determining potential, such as inherited illnesses, and environment and lifestyle determining whether that potential is activated. Eddie carried a psychological disorder rooted in genetics and ended his life, while the other 2 did not, despite sharing the same genes, because their upbringing, living standards, personal suffering, and resilience differed. The apple may fall from the tree, but which field that tree grows in matters more. And with that, this is where our video ends. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like and subscribe, and until the next video, stay curious.